So, we just went over how to change some elements in CSS and went over some basic syntax. But let's dig a little bit deeper now. What is CSS? So, CSS is a specific language that specifies how web pages are laid out and presented to users. Web browsers interpret the rules that we establish in CSS and affect the designated pages, elements, etc., etc. In our example, we saw how the CSS affects the color of text and how we can select things like the headers or bodies to change the background color or font color and all other sorts of properties. What does CSS stand for? So, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. When we look at this acronym, the style sheets makes obvious sense. CSS is a style sheet. The styles that we establish in CSS gets put on the HTML web browser. But what about the cascading part? Some of you might know this, but a cascade is another word for a small waterfall. The reason why that CSS is called cascading style sheets is because there's going to be a waterfall metaphor that really will establish itself as a set of rules. I'm going to get into this idea later and tell you guys why the waterfall metaphor is important. But for now, remember, cascade is another word for a small metaphor. Before we dig into how the CSS establishes its rules and hierarchy, we're first going to go over what can you select in CSS. So what can you select? In CSS, we can select elements, classes, and IDs. And these are things that we can establish a set of values and properties for when we code in CSS. Let's go over these individually. So far, we've been working with elements. We are familiar with them. So on the screen, what you see is a screenshot of some of my code from Mozilla Thimble. And you might recognize it from examples that we've already used. So examples of elements are body, H1 or header 1, and a paragraph element. So what else can we select? We already know we can select elements. So another way that you can select is selecting by class. So what is a class? In CSS, classes are a group of elements with the same properties. When you're creating your rules for your web page in CSS, meaning you're editing your CSS code, you get to define which elements belong in your class and which properties you want to affect. So you label which element is in a certain class on the HTML side, and you define what that means on the CSS side. I'll show you guys an example later in this tutorial. To signify a class in CSS, we put a period in front of the word. So before we would just write H1. Well, here we're going to write a period, and then we're going to spell out the name for the class. We get to name and define our classes because we're the ones making the rules for our web page in CSS. So this is a class is just an example of a word or a name of a class that we could use. Something you also should know is that you don't have to capitalize the name or any portion of your CSS if you don't want to. But the name is case sensitive. So if you're going to use a capital letter in the name of your class in your CSS, you have to call that class with a capital letter in your HTML as well. I'll show you guys an example of this later so it makes more sense. So what else can we select? We can select by ID. In CSS, an ID is a name for a specific object in your code. Like class, you get to define which element gets this ID. It's best coding practice to only give a specific ID to a specific element in your code. So only one object in your code should have an ID. A metaphor that you can think about is how in real life, each person gets their own unique ID. And if more than one person had the exact same ID, it can get confusing to who is actually who. To signify an ID in our CSS, we put a hashtag in front of it. So why is it important to know what we can select in our CSS? It's important to know what we can select, because the rules that we establish in our CSS are also dictated by another set of factors that tie close together with our selectors. These rules are the importance, meaning how important is the thing you're selecting according to what kind of object it is. The specificity, which means how specific a selector is, and the source order, meaning what order is the code being read from top to bottom in our CSS.